Guys, how are you? Good to see you, buddy. Hello. Oh, I guess I can sit here.
You can. Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
Well, good evening. My name is Janet Tran, and I am privileged to serve as the director of our Center for Civics, Education, and Opportunity at the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation and Institute in Washington, D.C. But it's always good to be home at the Reagan Library. So thank you so much for joining us this evening. In honor of the men and women who defend our freedoms around the world, I'd like you to please stand and join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. You may be seated. So before we get started, I'd like to thank some good friends of the Reagan Foundation who are with us this evening. Former Congressman Elton Gallegly and his wife Janice. Thank you for your years of steadfast support. We truly appreciate it. And John O'Hurley and his family, most of you know him from Seinfeld and Family Feud, but we are thankful for his support of our education work and for serving as a final round judge of the Great Communicator Debates. So much thanks there. Now, our special guest this evening, who has truly outdone himself by taking us on an incredible journey to the past with his latest book, has helped put a lot of things into perspective. And he's made me think a lot about precedents, or why we do things the way we do. For instance, we start every program here at the Reagan Library with the Pledge of Allegiance. And while I think most of you may be able to guess why, I want to be explicit about the reason why we do so. And I believe it is because our founder, the 40th president, would have wanted it that way, right? And in fact, we know this to be true because he left us with words of warning in his farewell address, a speech that I and many of my colleagues here at the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation and Institute consider our North Star. In his farewell address, President Reagan called for, quote, an informed patriotism. He noted that while he was pleased with the resurgence of national pride in this country and during his tenure, those good feelings alone wouldn't take us very far. And he stressed the need for Americans to take a critical and honest look into the past and apply those lessons to the present and the future. President Reagan, he argued that Americans needed to be informed not just about dates and facts, but about America's place in the world and the values that she stands for. Otherwise, how can we safeguard her future? So not just patriotism, not blind patriotism, but an informed patriotism. So, at the Reagan Library, this is why we start every event with the Pledge of Allegiance, and we ensure it is followed with discourse and dialogue, hopefully worthy of the American experiment. And why did President Reagan deliver a farewell address? Well, of course, that president, as many of you know, is a tradition started by our first president, George Washington, the subject matter of Bret Baier's latest book, To Rescue the Constitution, George Washington and the Fragile American Experiment. You are all here tonight because of Bret. And in many ways, the Reagan Library is his second home, so I don't believe we'll need a lengthy introduction. Bret is on your television set every night, and most recently, he's covering some of the troubling news from our nation's capital and heartbreaking events across the globe right as we speak. But tonight, I'm thankful that he's wearing his historian hat to provide us very needed perspective. And he is a historian, a people's historian. This is actually his 5th presidential biography, covering critical moments in Eisenhower, Reagan, Franklin D. Roosevelt, and Grant's administration. And tonight, we go back to the beginning to explore George Washington. So Bret, it is always a pleasure and an honor to have you join us. Ladies and gentlemen, a warm round of applause to welcome to the Reagan Library stage Fox News' chief political anchor, best-selling author, and most importantly, informed patriot, Bret Baier.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. It's really great to be back here. I didn't take the stage cue very well at the beginning, but it is awesome to be back here. This is actually the 6th book that I've talked about here. The first book was about my son's journey with congenital heart defects, and I'm here to tell you that he is doing spectacular. He is he is 6'4", and I'm very happy he looks like me because I'm not 6'4", and he's doing great. But we're here to talk history, and I'm really excited about this book, and really thank you very much for doing what John Heybush has done for many, many years, which is have this conversation about something I'm really fired up about.
I'm glad we started out about good news from your son, Bret, because these are dizzying and somber times, right? And this is why I'm so thrilled to be able to maybe learn some lessons, and where we have some audience questions as well that were submitted. Let's start maybe at the end, right, with these farewell addresses that I referred to. Both are incredible pieces of work if you haven't had the chance to listen or read them. But President Washington, he warns us to avoid political factions. And President Reagan asked us to reclaim our civic duties. So I'd say pretty good advice, right, from both of these gentlemen. But we're not doing so great of a job at following that advice. So maybe we can start with this not so easy question of how do we get there?
Yeah. Well, first of all, the farewell address of Washington is really something that everybody should every once in a while just touch base with, look back at, because it was really prescient. And it is read on the Senate floor every February 22nd on Washington's birthday. It is something that is in the back of my book, printed for everybody to read from beginning to end. In it, as you mentioned, he warns about political partisanship. He warns about political parties. And the quote he says is that if you don't quench it, the fire will consume and overtake. He was prescient in that because obviously we live in a very divided time. And that has come to pass. By the way, he also was concerned about the national debt. Don't think he would be too happy with $33 trillion currently. He was also concerned about foreign entanglements, making sure that we had our own house in order before we took place overseas. There was a lot in that speech that other presidents, the 40th president, Dwight D. Eisenhower's farewell address, has echoes of all of that in it. But I think what you're getting at here is, should we be encouraged by looking backwards, or should we be dismal about where we are? And I think what I learned in this process is that the research and the writing led me to the conclusion that dissent is who we are as a country. It's kind of baked in the cake, and we value that principle. Dissent is great. We have to welcome it, but union is what George Washington was trying to get to. And he meshed dissent and union and figured out how to get to common ground and get things done. And so that's sometimes what we're missing. It is happening on Capitol Hill. I try to do this thing on my show called Common Ground, a Democrat and a Republican coming together, talking about what they're working on and not what they're fighting about. But day to day, you don't feel it. And I think that if we go back to the beginning and the lessons of the Founding Fathers, that is something we can pull from every day.
That's wonderful. I love that. Dissent is baked into the cake. It's a part of our DNA, right? I want to pull on the thread of the grand tradition of the farewell address, because in your book, you argue that giving the farewell address is actually part of this grand man's greatest legacy, is actually deciding to deliver this farewell address when the opportunity to never deliver it was clearly handed to him.
Yeah. His greatest thing is when he becomes president that he then doesn't at the end of 2 terms. He decides, I'm not indispensable. And he decides that that's the end. And there is no prescribed term limits at that time. Remember, there is no, at the formation of our country, there is nobody who's writing a note in the Oval Office desk telling him how to do the job. There's nobody that is passing the torch. He is the torch. And so at that moment to say, this is it, I'm not indispensable, and for the good of the country, I need to step down and start this farewell address, is really something. This book, though, focuses on this soda straw moment that I think is overlooked in history books. And that's what each one of these books we've been trying to do. You know, 3 days in January was the farewell address for Dwight D. Eisenhower, 3 days before John F. Kennedy's inauguration. Everybody focuses on the military-industrial complex, but as I said, there was a lot in that speech as well about the national debt and working together, other things. Then 3 days in Moscow, Ronald Reagan and the fall of the Soviet Empire was about the overlooked summit between Reagan and Gorbachev, where Reagan delivers this amazing speech that history kind of overlooked under a bust of Lenin, where he talks to Moscow State University students and tells them communism will never work in Moscow while he's getting a deal on missiles. I mean, that's pretty bold. But that was a moment, a soda straw moment that was overlooked. And then 3 days at the brink, FDR, Churchill, and Stalin meeting in Tehran. That's not the conference that often got talked about. But at Tehran, they plan D-Day and figure out how the war is going to be won. And that is actually the beginning of the Cold War, because Stalin turns his back on the whole deal. So it was, you know, the middle of the Cold War, the end of the Cold War, then it was the Star Wars trilogy, and I went back to the beginning, and there's the 3 of the Cold War. And then to rescue the Republic was Ulysses S. Grant and the fragile American Union. And this is 1876, when Grant as president, who is overlooked as president, was really one of our most consequential presidents because he managed to hold the country together from falling back into a second civil war. So those are the things that I was looking for, these soda straw moments that I think enrich the narrative to be able to put people in the room and have this reading like you're there, you know it, you kind of get the characters. This is a look at the soda straw moment after the Revolutionary War. The British are defeated, which in and of itself is a miracle, which we'll talk about. But at that moment, the country is falling apart. It's held together under the Articles of Confederation, largely, and they just don't have teeth. And you can't levy taxes, tax collectors are getting beaten up, there's rebellions, states are fighting each other. In fact, a large portion of the population says, you know what, forget it. Let's go back to British rule. It's just not worth it. And
that very much could have happened.
Yeah, and it could have happened. At that moment, in May of 1787, the Constitutional Convention is called in Philadelphia, and they tap the guy who commanded revolutionary forces, George Washington, to be the head of that. And I argue in this book, without his particular temperament, without his particular leadership at that time, the dissent in that room to try to hammer out a document. Originally, they were just going to go around the edges and tweak the Articles of Confederation. And he said, no, it needs to be ripped up, root and branch, and start over. And in those 4 months, in a very hot Philadelphia room, now called Independence Hall, they hammer out this document that to this day is the greatest single legal document providing liberty to any country in any part of our world.
It is the greatest contribution to Western civilization, right, that our country has given. The historical record states That George Washington spoke how many words during this convention?
Not many at all, very few.
Yeah, very few, but he's, you really do paint a picture for us. It's truly a conversational book. You really do feel like you're in the room. That, he's out there every night lobbying, hearing out people's grievances, and he's so instrumental during this really fragile time. I'm so fascinated that the historical record on George Washington is actually one of the few cases where the truth is so much better than what we learned in school. And I wonder if you have some reflections in your research about maybe the aspects of his character that stood out to you.
His temperament obviously was a lead. Every time he was asked to do something, he answered the call. He was all about service, that the country was bigger than him. He didn't want to. He desperately wanted to just go back to Mount Vernon and be with Martha and her 2 children who he adopted. But each time, he answered the call. And, talking about his temperament, the reason I brought out these pages is because I love coming to the Reagan Library because there's always a President Reagan moment that fits. So I looked this up, and this is George Washington's 250th birthday. President Reagan's in his 2nd year of his presidency, and he gives an address at Mount Vernon. By the way, I got this tie from Mount Vernon. It's my Mount Vernon George Washington tie. Anyway, President Reagan says this: "If one word could describe all this man was and all he meant, it might be indispensable. Had he not lived, perhaps some other great leader would have appeared to liberate the colonies and establish our republic. We'll never know. We'll never know." Well, we know that Washington was there, that he did fulfill this destiny, and that he did it with such a skill and perfection, he seemed to be carrying out a divine plan for America. Are we keeping the faith with his trust in us? The problems we face today don't require the kind of sacrifices Washington and his men made that Christmas night on the Delaware, but they do require us to sustain our best efforts to believe in each other, to believe in the God who has blessed us and will help us to rebuild our country. Not bad. Not bad.
Great.
I tried to do a whole audio book like that, and it just did not work.
Exhausting.
Well, you can only say "well" so many times. Well, there you go again.
That's also not bad.
But to his point, the indispensable man in the room, I think that is really what you come to the conclusion of. He did not say many words at all in the Constitutional Convention. However, he had this thoughtful presence. He wasn't the elite scholar that Thomas Jefferson was. He wasn't the intellectual rigor of James Madison or John Adams. He wasn't the backslapping charisma or genius of Ben Franklin, and he surely wasn't the fiery speaker of Alexander Hamilton. But what he was this thoughtful presence who, with every step, provided gravitas. He was tall. He was 6'2". And at that time, it was like a statuesque figure. And he walked in the room, and he commanded that respect, not only because of his time running and commanding the revolutionary forces, and that was a miracle in and of itself, considering the forces that he had, but because of how he approached things. It was very thoughtful, and it was listen first. Listen first to all the sides. Figure out how you can get them to agree on something. We're talking about big issues in these 4 months, big issues that we still deal with today. States' rights versus federalism, representation for big states and small states, what the executive is going to look like, what are the levers of power. And, they're hammering this out, and multiple times throughout this process, the thing almost implodes. In fact, at times they say, forget it, let's just leave, it's not working, go back to the Articles of Confederation. And he is the one that eventually gets it over the finish line. They sign it, and he sits at the front of the room. And if you've ever been to Independence Hall, and you just were there, it is spectacular. And you do feel like these whispers of ghosts of hammering out some of this stuff that is our U.S. Constitution. And I commend you to go there because it gives you goosebumps, really. I'm just not a history nerd. I think it does. And in the front of the room is this wooden chair that Washington would sit in. And they're hammering through all this stuff, and he would sit in the chair and not say much. Well, the chair had this carving in it, a liberty pole and cap, and then it had a sun on the back of the chair. And they're signing the U.S. Constitution after the 4 months, and Ben Franklin says, you know, I've often looked at that chair, and I've looked at that sun, and wondered whether it was rising or setting. Thank God it's rising today. But he doesn't know, they don't know, if it's still going to set, because they still have to get ratification. And that's a process in and of itself that Washington calls a miracle. As you look at the Revolutionary War, the Constitutional Convention, the ratification, and then his presidency, you can't look at that and say that there wasn't some sort of divine intervention, because it was not meant to happen numerous times. And it almost fell apart. And I think that's really instructive as you think about our current time. It's bad, it's partisan, it's divided. But through our history, we've had really dark times, and we've managed to get through. Even at the beginning, when we almost didn't get to the starting line. And then think about the Civil War, how dark that was. After the Civil War, almost falls apart. The 60s and 70s, the riots, Vietnam, the civil race riots. Think about all we've been through as a country. And in the history of the world, it's actually not that long. We're coming up on 250 years. And, you know, there's generations and generations and 3 generations removed, and then somebody shook the hand of George Washington. You know, and so I think that perspective, especially for our generation and younger, kids are missing history. They're really missing out. And one of the reasons I'm doing some of this is to get it back in there.
Yeah. We will look at your future endeavor and talk about that soon. But I love that you are speaking about what our students are missing out on. And I'll bring it back to the 40th president, who in his farewell address encourages young people, if parents aren't talking about history, you should bring it up at the dinner table. And actually, in that 250th address that you have in your hand here, where he spoke at Mount Vernon, he actually says, hey, kids, if you're listening, and I'm paraphrasing, and I certainly won't try to mimic here.
Yeah. But, that was a poor attempt, by the way.
He says, you know, if George Washington makes you feel small, that's okay. I'm gonna let you in on a secret. He makes us all feel small. And you used the word, Bret. You said indispensable. And this is what brings him back so often, even though he wants to stay at Mount Vernon. He loves his wife. He cherishes his grandchildren. He truly is indispensable. And it makes me think about the fact that we're in a presidential library, a foundation. And there's a real temptation, right, to lionize presidents and speak about them in ways that they are, on this pedestal, and maybe, never look at their flaws, and any sort of challenges to their legacy is seen as almost, sacrilege. But you do a really wonderful job of portraying a man who is, he's fighting and governing, and that these aren't separate during this point. And he is not this chiseled, stone statue that we see in Washington, D.C. So I wonder if you could share maybe what shaped him and what you learned about these founding fathers who are not these statues, and they're not monolithic.
Yeah, they had faults, and they were not godlike. And the cherry tree story, unfortunately, is not true.
Yeah.
I mean, they were just looking for something to make them, look good. But he was a man, a normal man, and he was formed earliest by the loss of his father at 11. So he had to grow up really fast. And because of that, he was not afforded the education that a lot of his peers had, which was to go overseas and be taught in England. He didn't. He had stepbrothers and a half-stepbrother who they kind of looked after him, but he was educated here, and he wanted to get in the military, and that was tough. And it wasn't until his half-brother died, Lawrence, that he gets an appointment in the Virginia militia, which is the British military, and he gets early assignments that he really screws up. He really is kind of not a good soldier. He's not really good at what he's doing. A lot of people say he started the French and Indian War. He kind of attacked the wrong camp. He just was really bad, but he falls upwards. He stands by his commander in death. He gets promoted, and along the way learns how to be a soldier. And he is respected for that, despite his poor start. And he then inspires soldiers along the way and becomes this, again, an indispensable man, but this group that he's commanding is really lackluster. It's a ragtag group of soldiers, and they are fighting. Think about the audacity it takes to get this militia of group of soldiers to say, we're going to take on the best military in the world. I'm talking like the Bad News Bears versus the LA Dodgers. And let's just pretend the Dodgers made the World Series.
Let's, please.
I won't talk about that.
Too soon.
Oh, it's too soon.
Yeah.
But think about what they're doing here. And they're not well funded. They're not well trained. They're not well even clothed. The uniforms are falling off them. They have shoes that are falling apart. They have bloody feet in the winter of Valley Forge. And yet, he inspires them, saying that you are fighting for liberty. You are fighting for the liberty of this country. And maybe it's because there's no other alternative, and they know what the monarchy is, and they really don't like it, so they keep fighting. Meanwhile, the British are kind of sitting back on their heels and kicking back in Philadelphia in all of the rich places that they took over. And the revolutionary forces, commanded by George Washington, win, which is a miracle in any sense of the word. And there are multiple stories about how different things happen that you think, wow, had that not happened. To your bigger point, there were flaws with these men. The founders were not perfect, and they knew it. When they're forming this Constitution, they come to a lot of impasses that they're trying to get through because they know the country has to start. Here is a document that provides liberty, and yet they don't say the word slave. They don't talk about slavery in the document. They say in representation for states that a slave is 3/5 of a man. It's the antithesis of liberty. And those fights, I didn't really know or fully appreciate, are happening in that room in Philadelphia. They are battling about whether that should happen or not. The conclusion is, and there are really heavy fights about it, that the southern states won't sign on to a document if it deals with abolishing slavery at that point. They decide in a compromise that they're going to create these amendments. The Bill of Rights are going to be the first thing out of Congress. Those are the first 10 amendments. Obviously, the Constitution's been amended 27 times, but it's a high bar. They think that they're going to amend the Constitution to deal with slavery over time. Unfortunately, it was a lot of time, and our country spent decades and decades in the dark history of slavery. But what also I didn't know is that Washington considered that his biggest regret in his life. He later wrote on his deathbed that he thought it was the worst thing that he did as a person, his fault. He had a valet, Bobby Lee, for 20 years, who was very close to him. He became really one of his best friends. And he inherited about 12 slaves from his family. Martha had 122. She was a widow of a very rich person. So all of them worked on Mount Vernon. And what George Washington did as he was dying, as he said it was his biggest regret, he freed Bobby Lee, and he freed all of the remaining slaves at Mount Vernon after Martha's death and took care of their finances for the rest of their families' lives by the profits made at Mount Vernon. Now, that's something you don't hear about founding fathers. You hear a lot about the slavery part, but you don't hear about them battling with it internally. My purpose here is that, listen, I've got to cover it. I've got to cover different sides of how people think, and I do that fairly on the news. But when I'm writing these books, I throw in a little opinion there, and my opinion is we should embrace not erase our history. We should embrace our past and understand that there are really dark things that happened in our past, horrible things. But those men dealt with them back there in the environment they were in and really, really fought about it. And then over time, we evolved as a country. We are not a perfect union right now. We can be a more perfect union, but it doesn't help to erase where we've been. We're gonna go someplace else. Let's live where we've been and where we are and try to be better going forward.
I love that. I love that we were never promised perfect, just more perfect. So to be able to learn the lessons from the past is really critical. Thinking about the odds of even being in a room like the Constitutional Convention and winning this war, something that struck me was when he wrote, you described him writing back to Martha and saying, they've selected me as the commander-in-chief. There wouldn't be a president and commander-in-chief without George Washington. He actually includes his last will and testament as well. That's how severe and serious this commitment was. And I think his role is obviously central to the story, but what I really liked were the diversions in your book with these other players, if you will, other major founding fathers in this era. And we often teach history poorly, like they're all like bobbleheads nodding in agreement that, okay, we're all gonna revolt, okay, we're gonna start the Articles of Confederation.
Yeah,
okay.
it's like the wax guys down in Disney. They're all doing the talk, animatronics.
Right, but they're all so different, and you take this on some really fun diversions. I wonder if there's some interesting or surprising pieces of things that you learned about our founders as you were taking this research journey that you'd like to share with our friends here.
Sure. I mean, each one has a story, and there's little nuggets. This process, and I've talked about this before, I'm addicted to it because I think I learn a lot along the way. Briefly, I'll tell you that, and I've told this before, but this started with the Eisenhower book, and I got invited to Augusta National to play golf. I stayed in the Eisenhower cabin. It was the invite of invites, and poured myself a glass of wine or two and walked around and decided I wanted to learn about President Eisenhower. So I went to Abilene, Kansas, and I went there and said, listen, what can I write about? And they said, well, the farewell address really has not been delved into like it should. So I said, well, how do I do this? What do I do? I'm a reporter. And they said, well, you have to hire a researcher. Duh. And I said, okay, let's get the best one possible. And they said, well, we have the best one. And I met her, and her name was Sydney Soderberg. And she was the mayor of the neighboring town of Salina, Kansas. And she came in and she said, well, that is true. I am the best researcher. I said, that's fantastic. And she said, I need to tell you something. I watch your show. I said, wow, fantastic. That's even better. And she said, I like it. I said, okay, we're making progress. She said, but I need you to know that I am a true blue Kansas Democrat. And I said, that is great, because I am a news reporter trying to write his first history book. And we established this relationship. And that began this amazing journey where she goes into National Archives and different places and plants there for 6 months at a time and digs out this treasure trove of history nuggets that then become pieces of a quilt that we stitch together with my co-author Catherine Whitney and I. We bounce back and forth and then try to create this actual putting you in the room and meeting these characters, to your point. And this one really opened the eyes for me of different exchanges. The relationship that George Washington has, he was actually closest to Henry Knox, his Secretary of War. If you saw the musical Hamilton, where Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton are at each other, that's all true. They hated each other. And they were trying to one-up each other, and they were trying to undermine each other, and yet he put them on the cabinet as Secretary of Treasury, Secretary of State. His Attorney General is Edmund Randolph. He's kind of a non-player, but he's in the mix because they're all really close to advisors to Washington. Remember, this is all coming off the top of his head. This is not laid out. You know, he's making it up as he goes along on the executive stuff. He moves to New York, the capital, and starts as the first American president, unanimously elected. And it's chaos because all of the people say, I want to go see the new president. This is awesome. We have a great country. Let's go. So people just show up and say, hi, I'd like to see the president.
They don't even have a schedule.
No, there was no schedule.
Wild,
it was just walk in. And so it was chaotic. It was like Grand Central Station. And Martha had stayed back in Mount Vernon to watch over her grandchildren. Well, one of the things you learn is the relationship between George Washington and Martha is tremendously close. She is probably one of his closest advisors. He is head over heels in love with her. We would know more about the depth of that love if Martha Washington hadn't burned their correspondence after his death, but
a common practice amongst the women of that era.
At the era.
With the exception of John Adams, I think Abigail Adams is the only wife of a founding father who kept their correspondence.
Because Mrs. Adams really wanted to show how he was heartfelt, not always intellectually,
godlike.
Highbrow, yeah. But anyway, Martha and George are really, really close. He goes to New York. She's not there with him. He's fallen apart. It's chaotic. And he says, I need Martha here. So he turns to his aide, Tobias Lear, and he says, we have to figure out a way to get Martha up here. And he says, she loves seafood.
Oh, that's right.
I need you to draft a letter through our nephew to tell Mrs. Washington that we serve seafood all the time. And
oysters, to be specific,
oysters
right?
and shrimp on the table. So he writes this letter. He says, Mrs. Washington, it's a wonderful spread of oysters and shrimp almost every night here in New York, and they don't go untouched. Suddenly, Martha Washington ends up there about 5 days later. So seafood saved the day of the United States of America in its early days. But it's little things like that, little stories about the folks that I think really makes it juicy in the read.
That's they're fun little diversions, but I think it does help us realize that when we're going through these problems that we feel are so vast, these were humans as well. Your book has the word fragile in it, which makes us very concerned, I imagine, if you're in the audience here today. And obviously, the war lasted 8 years, and how we lasted 8 years in one, as you said, is completely confounding and a miracle. And the Articles of Confederation were pretty loose and not organized. And one takeaway I had was, we talk about how fragile we were back then, but there were a million inflection points, as you pointed out, where all of this that we so love, that we so cherish, could not have existed. So nothing about this country was certain. And what do you think were some moments that maybe we take for granted that were instrumental in the survival of our young republic?
Well, I think that we have to remember that the alternative has never been as present as it was for them. In other words, the alternative of a monarchy, the alternative of not controlling your own destiny, it was staring them in the face because they saw it in their lifetime. We haven't seen it. Every one of these presidents has some line that you have to fight for the republic. You have to fight to hold it together. We still, today, have to fight. Grant said it's a constant battle because we're one step away from losing it. And I do think that that is a part of the story, that we have to remember that we can't sleep on our laurels. We can't say this is all done. We've got to work at it. The peaceful transfer of power, it's only not happened twice in our history. It eventually happened, but it's only been challenged twice in our history. That's one of the best things George Washington did, was that peaceful transfer of power. And we've got to make sure, as a country, that we remember about how crucial that all is. I do think that, again, to read from my Reagan, which is, I'm apt to do.
We welcome that here.
He had a beautiful end to his farewell address, where he said, "Ours was the first revolution in the history of mankind that truly reversed the course of government with the three little words, we the people. We the people tell the government what to do. It doesn't tell us. We the people are the driver. The government is the car. And we decide where it should go and by what route and how fast." Almost all of the world's constitutions are documents in which governments tell the people what their privileges are. Our Constitution is a document in which we, the people, tell the government what it is allowed to do. We, the people, are free. This belief has been the underlying basis for everything I've tried to do these past 8 years. Think about we, the people, because we, the people, are the ones who control this whole operation. And sometimes I think we, the people, forget that. And it's not the other way around. So it really is, as I cover Washington, it is easy to get cynical. It's easy to say, man, this place is crazy. And turn around and say, this is not worth spending the time. But I do think there are good people up there on both sides of the aisle trying to do good things. They just have to be told by you how to drive the car and what route to take and what they're allowed to do and not allowed to do. Not the other way around. There you go.
Love that. I want to make sure we have time for me to read some of the audience submitted questions. So maybe I'll skip a few to this concept of leadership. And we're here at the house that Ronald Reagan built, the House of the Great Communicator, and all of our education work centers around cultivating that next generation of citizen leaders, answering President Reagan's call for an informed patriotism. And it was hard, while reading your book, not to make comparisons. And President George Washington is so often silent, as you point out, and President Reagan is the great communicator. So it just struck me there's just so many different ways to lead, and you've obviously done these deep dives of several leaders, and I wonder if you have any reflections about their service and how you look to perhaps communicate different ways of leadership to this next generation yourself.
Yeah, I think communicating your thoughts, what you value is important, is number one. And obviously Reagan did that better than arguably any president about articulating it. Some presidents are better at communicating than others. All of them have this service that is about putting America first before themselves. It seems that while they're all about the next election and you want to get elected and all the politics of that, in essence, their decision is about putting the country first when push comes to shove and when they're backed into a corner with a tough decision. And I think that is what drives a lot of these leaders. The thread throughout all these books is that they're always working to try to think what is best for America in the big picture. Different scenarios. Each one of the presidents that I've written about worked across the aisle in one way or another to try to get big things done. Dwight D. Eisenhower arguably was our most bipartisan president, working with Lyndon B. Johnson and Sam Rayburn, doing really big pieces of legislation, like the interstate highway system we drive on today, and other big things that they fought about, but ended up, like Washington, making it through the dissent to get to the Union.
Well, I did have a second part of the question, which is about how you are perhaps trying to reach the next generation.
Yes. So this book, this is a graphic novel that comes out November 12th. Now, this is the first one of these that I've done, but I thought it would be really fun, and it kind of sneaks in the history. It's called The History Club, Duel Across Time, and it's about an 8th grade history class that goes back in time to solve pieces of history that are being tweaked and changed by this evil character called the History Twister. But in this, which is kind of like a comic book, you get inferred and kind of, they learn history sneakily. It's actual history that is actually really cool. I had a lot of fun working with this illustrator and coming up with the thought process. Anyway, November 12th, it comes out, and it's for like 8 to 14. 8 to 14.
Sounds like a good Christmas present.
Yeah.
for your kids, your grandkids, right?
They work great together, right?
Yes, yes. Show it again, no. All right, so I'm gonna do my best to decipher handwriting here. And I shuffled to this question which asks, lovely handwriting, what would Washington think about the political environment in the US today, specifically regarding our political parties? So maybe diving into those factions again, kind of placing yourself in the general's mindset.
Well, I think he would say, I told you so. Here it is consuming. I think, like I said from the beginning, I think these early guys knew that it was going to be a battle. And they knew that over time, each generation was going to have their own challenges about how to fight it and how it looked. I'm sure he wouldn't be surprised that we're as divided as we are. But I think the fact that the U.S. Constitution over all this time has remained intact, it hasn't been amended, beyond the 27 times. I'll tell you really quickly, at the end of the book, there's this study by the National Constitution Center, and it's just a couple years ago, and they say to these three sets of scholars, all right, get together, and the scholars are libertarian scholars, conservative scholars, and progressive scholars. It sounds like they all go into a bar and no, but it's really true. This was a study.
They go into the National Constitution Center.
Yes, and so it's a real study, and they are well respected in each one of their ideological fields. And so they say to these scholars, I want you to rip up the Constitution and start over and come up with a new one. So they set out for 3 weeks to do this. It ends up taking about a month. And all three of the groups come back to the same document that was hammered out in 1787. Now, all three of them have suggestions. This is true, and I'm not making it up. The libertarian group comes back and says, we want every page to end with, and we mean it. True. The conservative group says the executive portion needs to be more clearly defined because executive orders are out of control. As you know, executive orders, presidents can write them. They kind of go around Congress. Remember, President Obama said, I have a pen and a phone. Washington wrote 8 executive orders. FDR wrote 3,216 in the New Deal. At this point, President Biden has had 150 executive orders. But they do go around Congress. And that's not even to add the signing statements that kind of adjust what Congress passes. But the next administration, oftentimes, as happened with this administration, exactly did the opposite executive order as the last. So that's what the conservatives would like to change. The progressive group says they need to change the Electoral College and do a ranked choice election system to change that. All of the groups think that the term limits for the Supreme Court should be at 18 years, not lifetime, so that you can avoid the politics of, a Supreme Court justice waiting until a Democrat or Republican gets in office and then retires, or if, the big to-do that has become a political process. That's a recommendation all three recommended. But in essence, they all went back to that same document. Now think about that. After all this time, all these people talking about it, and those guys hammered that out in that room 4 months in the sweaty Philadelphia. Pretty amazing.
Pretty brilliant.
Pretty amazing.
Yeah. And because we can't avoid politics, our next question, what would George Washington think of Donald Trump? It says thank you as well.
So
in case
were
you
these...
Yeah. They're polite.
Oh, it's very polite.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. Well, I know what Donald Trump thinks of George Washington. I tell you what, he is a fantastic, huge president. He does not have as good a poll numbers as your #1 president. I don't get to do that on the show.
We're glad to be of service here.
Yeah, I don't get to do that on the show that much. Listen, I think that there are elements of strength in leadership, decision-making, that George Washington would value. I think that he would have problems, and the biggest problem about January 6th, as that he set, that stipulation about peaceful transfer of power. Not that, it's all decided about how that all is going to fall out, but I think that you look at the president's policies, and you look at what people looked at during that administration on this side of the paper. And you look at January 6th and some of the things that he says and some of the things that are happening now and the reaction, social media, on this side of the paper. Now, it depends on how you look at it. And, we have to cover it fairly. And I think that we do. I think that it's going to be a fascinating election that we don't know how it's going to come out on either side. At the beginning of this process, I really didn't think that either leader of the party was going to be the nominee. And as we get closer and closer, it does feel like both men are going to be the nominees, which I think leads to a whole bunch of questions about how we the people, determine all that and what we think about it. So I joke about him saying about Washington, but I think he has used that, like, you couldn't get Washington, couldn't get DeSanctimonious elected, okay? But it's fun to think about.
Well, the next audience member has done their homework. So after your visit to the Middle East and your 2 interviews with the Saudi prince and the Israeli prime minister, I heard that your interviews would be the reason or catalyst for bringing the 2 closer than ever to a peace agreement. With the attack on Israel, do you feel that agreement will happen soon or be sadly postponed?
Yeah, I think that's fascinating. It really was a fascinating time. I'll briefly tell the story. I've been working on getting an interview with the Saudi Crown Prince, Mohammed bin Salman, MBS, for a long time, thinking that he was going to be the center of the Middle East for a long time. He's 38 years old. He's obviously had many controversial things, the Khashoggi incident, the 9/11 reaction, all of those things. And I wanted to ask that, but also about the future of the Middle East. So I've been working it for a long time, and I finally got the interview. And with the contingency that I could ask whatever I wanted to ask, and there wouldn't be any stipulations. So I went over, and we originally were told that the interview was going to be in Arabic, so we set up a simultaneous translator. And I had him in a room, in a box and I had a IFB in my ear, ready for the Arabic to listen. And I asked the first question, and he answered it in English. And I asked the second question, and he answered it in English. I said, wow, this is going to be in English. And it was. And it was fascinating. And I asked all those things, about those controversial things. And I also asked about the normalization efforts with Israel. There was a report that it was falling apart. And he said, no, it's not. In fact, we're getting closer every day. And it could change the face of the Middle East. I asked some more specific questions, and the interview went on a number of different topics. You may have seen it. It's online if you haven't. As the camera cut off, he said, Bret, I need you to know that this is going to happen, and we are really, really close, and this will change everything. Every country in this region will work differently. It will change how the Middle East works forever. And I said, Your Royal Highness, thank you very much. I get to the airport to go back to Riyadh. I was along the Red Sea, and I get to the airport to go to Riyadh, and I get a call from Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who says, I've seen the interview. I need you to come interview me so I can respond. I'm on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly in New York. So I rework my plane flight. I fly to New York. I land at 8:30 in the morning. I sit down with the Israeli Prime Minister at 11:30 a.m. And I start by asking, you saw this interview. What's your response, Mr. Prime Minister? And he says, in the words of a very smart man in the Middle East, we're getting closer every day, and it will change the face of the Middle East. That camera cuts off after a lot of questions about the trouble he's in and politically and et cetera, and he says, no, Bret, I need you to know this. It's going to change everything in the Middle East, and we are on the finish line. This is it. And I'm going to, essentially grab the brass ring. And at that moment, I thought, this is quite something. I mean, he essentially called so that he could talk to MBS over the television, in this moment. So I was working to set up an interview with Mahmoud Abbas in the West Bank, and we were down the road on doing that, and then October 7th happened. Now, I have since talked to all players, and believe it or not, even in this moment, when we don't know what's going to happen with Israel going into the ground in Gaza and how the Arab Street already is reacting, but how it will react even more when that intensifies, even in this moment, both sides are saying, we are still hopeful that this is going to be worked out in the long run. Now, we'll see. Maybe that is rose-colored glasses. But to hear both leaders talk about it, both on camera and off camera, I came away thinking, this could be a game changer for the whole region.
Well, thank you for sharing that with us. We certainly all need a dose of hope right now, right? There is a question addressed, we'll save the most hopeful one for last, but Bret, did Washington's character have any significant, quote, human flaws? And you spoke a little bit about that, but perhaps you can respond to maybe that question or other founders as well.
Yeah, let's see. I think the interesting thing was we didn't know a lot about his childhood, and he wasn't that much of a troublemaker. He did like women, though, as a teenager. Yes. And a young man.
And this is from a student age 17.
Oh, there you go.
LJ Rousseau.
And he did like the ladies, and he had his heart broken a couple times, and he wrote a poem about being heartbroken. So he used the poem to express his dismay that he was kind of turned down by this one young lady, but that led soon thereafter to meeting Martha, and he fell head over heels right away with what he called his pocket Venus, which is a short, beautiful person.
And the ladies loved him as well, correct?
They did.
Yeah,
I mean, yeah, he was a tall drink of water.
We'll put that in the biography. All right. Well, this is our favorite question. You gave us a brief update at the beginning, but the question is, how is your wonderful son? If you don't mind giving us an update.
So yeah. As I said, he's had 4 open heart surgeries and 10 angioplasties. He is 6'4.5". I cut him a half, but he's 6'4.5". And he plays on the golf team. He has beaten his dad, unfortunately, a couple times, which is a major development. And I'm coming to grips with it. It's the best thing ever and the worst thing ever. But he is doing well. And his brother, who's 13, is doing great. And so the family is fantastic. So we are very blessed. And I'm trying to get them into history. They don't watch TV. They watch on the phone. So the only way they know I did something is if I post it on Instagram.
They watch that. That's
but they don't.
Sure.
I'm trying to get them back on regular TV. But everybody's doing great. Thank you for asking.
So final parting words. Oh, yes. Final parting words for us. A little piece of advice. How do we as Americans continue to rescue the Constitution?
I think we have to keep learning. And I suggest, and this is how I've been learning, is this process of going back and digging in. Sidney Soderbergh and Catherine Whitney and I are doing the work for you. You just have to read it or listen to it. And I think it really does help to look about where we've been, because to look backwards to where we've been helps us to look where we're going to go. I know that sounds cliche, but I do see a lot of it every time I do one of these things. Like, oh, I'm dealing with this now. And for me, as an anchor, it does give me a perspective to be able to tap into when I'm talking about something. Not only the times that I've covered, the White House or the Pentagon or the things that I've covered personally, but the things that I've covered as this reporter of history, able to tap into some of that as an anchor. So I appreciate you reading it. Thank you for watching, and thank you for being here. I'm happy to sign as many books as you want to buy.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much, Bret. Get yourself a copy of To Rescue the Constitution and the History Club.
All right, thank you so much.
Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated as our special guest leaves the building.